If you've ever asked yourself, why do I still feel attached, even after everything? This is for you. Because one of the most painful misunderstandings survivors carry is this belief. If I were stronger, I wouldn't still feel connected. That belief is wrong. And it keeps you stuck. Narcissists don't keep you hooked because you're weak. They keep you hooked because your trauma became the access point. Most people think manipulation happens through charm, lies, or control. But the deepest hook doesn't come from what they say. It comes from what your nervous system learned while you were hurting. Here's the part no one explains clearly enough. Your pain didn't push him away. Your pain made you easier to access. During the relationship, every moment of emotional distress became data. He learned. When you felt guilty. When you felt afraid of losing him. When you tried harder. When you abandoned yourself to keep peace. Those moments weren't accidents. They became patterns. And patterns become leverage. You weren't just bonding with him. Your nervous system was bonding to relief. Relief that only came after distress. So every time he pulled away, criticized, withheld affection, or created confusion, and then returned with just enough warmth, your body learned something dangerous. This pain leads to connection. That's how trauma bonds form. And once trauma becomes linked to connection, love is no longer required to keep you attached. That's why leaving doesn't immediately break the bond. That's why distance doesn't automatically bring peace. That's why clarity alone isn't enough. Because what you're fighting isn't longing, it's conditioning. Many survivors say, I knew it was bad, but my body kept hoping. That hope didn't come from your heart. It came from your nervous system remembering the pattern. And narcissists know this, even if they don't consciously plan it. They don't need you to trust them. They don't need you to believe them. They only need you to feel unsettled enough to engage. And trauma is the fastest way to create that engagement. This is why his silence hits harder than his words. His return feels confusing, instead of comforting. Your body reacts before your mind can stop it. Guilt shows up even when you did nothing wrong. Because trauma narrows focus. And narrowed focus keeps you emotionally available. But here's the shift that begins everything. Once you see how trauma was used, you stop blaming yourself for being affected by it. And when self-blame stops, the bond starts to weaken. In the next part, I'll explain how narcissists trigger old wounds on purpose. And why those specific wounds are never random. One of the hardest truths to accept is this. The narcissist didn't stumble into your wounds by accident. He learned them. Not through deep empathy. Not through emotional intimacy. But through observation during moments of pain. Every time you were hurt, confused, or afraid of losing him, your nervous system revealed something important. It showed him where you were most open, and where emotional access was easiest. This isn't because you share too much. It's because trauma exposes sensitivity. During the relationship, he paid attention to moments like, when you apologized even though you were hurt, when you tried harder after being criticized, when silence made you anxious, when you feared abandonment, when you questioned yourself instead of his behavior. These moments taught him something crucial. Distress makes you reachable, so without needing to plan consciously, he began repeating patterns that activated those exact emotional states. Not because he wanted to hurt you, but because those states produced engagement. Why your deepest wounds felt accidentally triggered. Many survivors say, it felt like he always knew exactly what to say to hurt me. That's because emotional wounds respond faster than logic. When someone touches an unresolved fear, rejection, abandonment, inadequacy, being too much, your body reacts immediately. Thought comes later, and once that reaction happens, the narcissist regains access. You explain yourself. You defend your intentions. You try to repair. You seek reassurance. That response becomes reinforcement. Trauma creates emotional shortcuts. Healthy connection grows through safety and consistency. Trauma bonds grow through emotional shortcuts. Instead of trust building slowly, the bond intensifies through crisis, relief, fear, reconciliation. Your nervous system learns that emotional pain leads to emotional closeness, even if that closeness is temporary. And once that wiring exists, it can be activated again and again. There is a moment in this process that feels subtle on the outside, but internally, it changes the entire dynamic. It's the moment when your trauma no longer produces the reaction the narcissist expects. Not because you healed everything, not because the pain disappeared, but because your nervous system stops opening the same doors. At first, this shift can feel confusing. You still feel emotions. You still remember what happened. but the familiar urgency is gone. And when that urgency disappears, the narcissist notices. Why the dynamic starts breaking before you feel strong. Many people think power shifts when you feel confident. In reality, power shifts when your reactions become less predictable. Trauma creates predictability. You respond quickly. You explain yourself. You seek reassurance. You try to repair. When trauma stops guiding your behavior, that predictability weakens. And for a narcissist, unpredictability feels threatening, not because you changed your words, but because your body stopped responding on cue. This is when his behavior often intensifies. When trauma no longer guarantees access, narcissists rarely reflect. They escalate. You might notice more emotional messages, sudden vulnerability, sharper guilt tactics, nostalgia, reminders of your bond, statements meant to provoke insecurity. This escalation is not desperation for love, it's desperation for regulation. He is trying to reactivate the pathway that once worked. Why escalation feels confusing, instead of comforting. This is where many survivors feel disoriented. You might think, he seems more emotional now. He's opening up. Why does this feel off? It feels off because your nervous system is no longer syncing with his emotional rhythm. What once felt magnetic, now feels chaotic. What once felt intense, now feels invasive. That discomfort is not fear, it's mismatch. When escalation fails, withdrawal often follows. If increased emotional pressure doesn't reopen access, the narcissist may retreat. Silence, coldness, distance. This silence is not peace, it's a final test. In the past, silence activated your deepest fear: abandonment, rejection, invisibility. Now, your body notices the silence, but doesn't collapse under it. That's when the dynamic truly begins to unravel. Why this stage feels emotionally strange for you. You may feel sadness without longing, distance without anger, awareness without urgency. This emotional neutrality can feel unsettling because it's unfamiliar. But unfamiliar does not mean unsafe. It means your trauma is no longer in control. This is where self-blame loses its grip. When trauma stops dictating your reactions, you begin to see clearly. Your pain was real. Your reactions were conditioned. Your attachment made sense. Your confusion was learned. And that understanding dissolves shame. Without shame, the narcissist loses leverage. Here is the turning point most people miss. The bond doesn't break when you leave. It breaks when your trauma is no longer usable. And that happens internally long before it shows up externally. In the next part, we'll explore how narcissists react psychologically when they sense they can no longer reach you the same way, and why this often leads to one final attempt. When a narcissist senses that your trauma is no longer granting him automatic access, something critical happens inside his internal system. Urgency replaces confidence. This is often the most confusing stage for survivors, because the narcissist behavior may briefly resemble what you always hoped for. He may sound more reflective, more emotional, more aware, more invested. And that resemblance is what makes this phase dangerous. This is not growth. It's threat response. A narcissist does not suddenly change because he understands your pain. He changes his presentation because his usual tools stopped working. What he feels at this stage is not love. It's the fear of losing access. Access to your emotional reactions, your empathy, your attention, your availability. When that access weakens, his system signals danger. And danger triggers one last attempt. Why this attempt often feels more real than before. Many survivors say, this time felt different. He seemed sincere. He finally said the things I needed to hear. That's not imagination. This attempt often feels more convincing because it is fueled by urgency. And urgency creates emotional intensity. But intensity is not sincerity. Urgency says, I'm losing control. Growth says, I take responsibility, even if I lose you. The difference is subtle, but decisive. Common forms of the last attempt. This phase often includes partial accountability. I wasn't perfect, but emotional confessions without long-term action. Promises without structure. Nostalgic storytelling. Framing you as the only one who understands me. These behaviors are designed to reawaken your trauma-based empathy. They pull on your compassion, your hope, your fear of being unfair, your desire to believe the best. Not because you are naive, but because those traits once kept the bond alive. Why this attempt fails when trauma no longer leads. Here is the key shift. Your body no longer opens emotionally the way it used to. You may listen, but you don't lean forward. You may feel something, but you don't abandon yourself. You may respond, but without urgency. And without urgency, the attempt loses power, because narcissistic control relies on emotional acceleration. When acceleration doesn't happen, the strategy collapses. This is where many survivors feel guilt again. You might think, am I being cold? Am I not giving him a chance? Shouldn't I respond differently? That guilt is the echo of conditioning, not intuition. Intuition feels grounded. Guilt feels pressurized. The most important truth of this stage: if his last attempt doesn't move you the way it used to, it's not because you hardened. It's because your trauma is no longer available as leverage. And when trauma can't be used, manipulation loses its engine. In the next part, we'll explore what happens internally for you after this final attempt fails, and why many people feel an unexpected emotional quiet, followed by clarity. After the narcissist's final attempt doesn't land the way it used to, something very specific happens inside you. Not relief, not celebration, but a quiet internal shift that many people don't immediately recognize. It feels like emotional decompression. For a long time, your nervous system stayed slightly tense even during distance, waiting, watching, preparing. There was always a part of you braced for impact, expecting another message, another pull, another disruption. When the last attempt fails, that vigilance finally begins to stand down. A woman once said, "It felt like my body realized before my mind that it was over." That sentence captures this stage perfectly. Your nervous system stops scanning for him. This is subtle, but powerful. You notice, you're not checking your phone as often. His name doesn't trigger an immediate response. Silence feels neutral, instead of threatening. Your thoughts drift elsewhere naturally. This isn't detachment through effort. It's detachment through biological recalibration. Your body no longer expects him to be the source of emotional regulation. You stop needing emotional resolution. For a long time, you may have wanted explanations, apologies, clarity, acknowledgement. But now, those desires soften, not because they were fulfilled, but because your system no longer believes they're necessary for peace. That realization often feels strange. You might think, I thought I needed closure. Why don't I care the way I expected? The answer is simple. Your body stopped asking questions your mind used to ask. Grief appears, but it's different. This is important. Some sadness may surface, but it's not longing for him. It's grief for the time invested. The version of you that tried so hard. The hope that kept you going. The self you abandoned to survive. This grief is clean. It doesn't pull you back. It moves through you, instead of trapping you. You stop interpreting neutrality as loss. Earlier in the process, emotional neutrality felt like emptiness. Now, it feels like space. Space to think clearly. Rest emotionally. Notice yourself. Feel grounded. The absence of chaos no longer feels wrong. It feels earned. You begin trusting what your body knows. This is where self-doubt finally loosens. You stop asking, was it really that bad? Did I exaggerate? Should I have done more? Because your body already answered those questions. It didn't reopen. It didn't surge. It didn't collapse. That response tells the truth more clearly than any memory. This stage doesn't feel dramatic, and that's the point. Drama was part of the bond. Intensity was part of the hook. Healing feels quiet because your system is no longer activated. And quiet is not absence of feeling, it's absence of threat. Why this stage is irreversible. Once your nervous system stops expecting emotional disruption from him, the loop cannot restart. Not because you promised yourself anything, but because your body now recognizes safety elsewhere. That recognition changes how you relate to everything moving forward. In the next part, we'll explore how this internal calm reshapes your boundaries in future relationships, and why you no longer need to protect yourself the way you used to. One of the most surprising changes after a narcissistic dynamic loosens its grip is this. You don't suddenly become better at setting boundaries. You simply stop crossing your own. For a long time, boundaries felt exhausting. You had to explain them, defend them, justify them, and even then, they were often ignored or punished. That wasn't because you were bad at boundaries. It was because you were in a system that required you to self-abandon in order to stay connected. As healing settles in, something shifts internally. You no longer negotiate your limits in your head. You no longer prepare speeches. You no longer brace for backlash. Your boundaries begin forming before words are needed. Boundaries become internal first, not verbal. This is key. Before, you tried to set boundaries externally, by explaining your needs, by asking for understanding, by hoping to be met halfway. Now, boundaries are internal. You feel when something is off. You pause instead of pushing through. You disengage instead of arguing. You stop offering access automatically. This is not avoidance. It's self-alignment. You stop confusing discomfort with danger. Inside a narcissistic dynamic, discomfort always felt dangerous. Silence, disagreement, emotional distance, they triggered fear. Now, your body understands something new. Discomfort does not equal threat. So when someone reacts poorly to your boundary, your system no longer panics. You don't rush to fix it. You let the reaction belong to them. Your no becomes quieter and stronger. You may notice. You say less. You explain less. You justify less. You feel less guilt. Your no doesn't need volume. It needs consistency. And consistency is something a narcissistic dynamic cannot survive. People respond differently, and that tells you everything. Some people adjust. Some push back. Some fade away. You don't chase clarity from their reactions anymore. You understand. Respect doesn't require persuasion. Care doesn't demand self-erasure. Connection doesn't come with punishment. This understanding brings peace. You stop performing emotional labor. This is a huge shift. You no longer manage other people's emotions. You don't pursue. You don't absorb tension. You don't take responsibility for reactions. You stay present without self-sacrifice. That presence feels grounded instead of anxious. Boundaries stop feeling like walls. Before, boundaries felt defensive, like protection from harm. Now, they feel orienting. They guide where your energy goes. Who has access? What feels aligned? What drains you? You're no longer keeping people out. You're keeping yourself in. This is how healing becomes visible. Not through confrontation. Not through declarations. But through changed participation. You simply don't engage in what harms you anymore. And because narcissistic dynamics rely on overengagement, explanation, and emotional availability, they dissolve naturally when those are no longer offered. In the next part, we'll explore how this internal stability reshapes your sense of connection and love, and why future relationships feel calmer, even if they don't feel as intense. One of the most confusing stages of healing arrives quietly, often when you least expect it. It's the moment you realize that healthy connection doesn't feel like what you were taught to recognize as love, and instead of relief, many people feel discomfort. A woman once said, "Nothing was wrong, and that's what made me nervous." That reaction is more common than people admit. When you've been conditioned inside a narcissistic dynamic, your nervous system learned to associate connection with intensity. Love came with emotional highs and lows. Care came with uncertainty. Attention came with fear of loss. So when those elements disappear, your body doesn't immediately register safety. It registers absence of stimulation. Why calm can feel boring after chaos. Inside the old dynamic, your body lived in cycles: anticipation, anxiety, relief, confusion. Those cycles created chemical intensity, adrenaline, cortisol, dopamine spikes from intermittent validation. Healthy connection doesn't produce that chemical roller. It feels steady, predictable, emotionally accessible, respectful. And for a nervous system used to chaos, that can feel strangely flat. This is where many people think, something is missing. I don't feel the spark. Maybe I'm not really connected. But what's missing is not love. What's missing is dysregulation. Healthy connection doesn't activate survival mode. This is the key difference. You don't feel the need to monitor tone, prove your worth, manage moods, stay high. Your body stays grounded. And because survival mode is off, the connection doesn't feel urgent. Urgency once masqueraded as passion. Now, urgency feels unnecessary. Why this stage often triggers many survivors worry. Am I emotionally numb? Did I lose my ability to feel deeply? Why doesn't this feel intense? But intensity is not depth. Depth is consistency over time. Depth is emotional availability without fear. Depth is safety that doesn't need to be earned. Your nervous system is learning a new definition of connection. And learning takes time. Healthy love grows slowly, and that's intentional. Narcissistic bonds form fast. They accelerate intimacy. They collapse boundaries. Healthy connection respects pacing. It allows curiosity without pressure, closeness without possession, space without punishment. That pace may feel unfamiliar, but unfamiliar doesn't mean wrong. This is where many people rewire their definition of attraction. Attraction begins shifting from intensity gives consistency, urgency gives availability, anxiety gives calm. And that shift is profound. You stop being drawn to emotional chaos. You start noticing how people make you feel after interactions, not during them. Calm becomes attractive. Safety becomes magnetic. This stage confirms healing, even if it doesn't feel dramatic. If healthy connection feels quieter than what you're used to, that's not a loss. That's your nervous system choosing regulation over survival. And once your body learns that connection doesn't require pain, the old dynamics lose their pull completely. In the final part, we'll bring everything together, showing why narcissists can no longer hook you once this shift occurs, and how this becomes a permanent change rather than a phase. There is a quiet moment, often unnoticed, when the narcissist's influence truly ends. Not when you block them, not when you confront them, not even when you stop thinking about them completely. It ends when your nervous system no longer recognizes them as relevant. This is the stage where people say, "He tried again. And it didn't work. He reached out. And I felt nothing. I saw the pattern instantly." And what's important to understand is this. This isn't resistance. It's disconnection. Narcissists hook through emotional predictability. For a narcissist to hook you, your reactions must follow a familiar script. Guilt when they withdraw. Hope when they return. Anxiety when they're silent. Relief when they engage. That script once lived in your body. But now, that script is gone. Your nervous system no longer accelerates. Your mind no longer rushes. Your emotions no longer organize around them. Without predictable reactions, manipulation collapses. Why their tactics suddenly feel obvious. At this stage, you don't feel confused anymore. You feel observant. You notice recycled phrases, emotional bait, vague accountability, urgency without substance. Not with anger, but with clarity. It feels similar to watching a movie you've already seen. You recognize the plot before it unfolds. That recognition is not intellectual. It's embodied. This is why the change becomes permanent. Once your nervous system learns safety without chaos, it doesn't forget. You can't unlearn this. Your body now knows. Love doesn't hurt. Connection doesn't destabilize. Silence doesn't mean danger. Boundaries don't cause abandonment. And because this knowledge lives in your body, not just your thoughts, the old dynamic can't restart, even if the narcissist tries. Why they often disappear at this stage. Many narcissists fade away when they sense this shift. Not because they've healed, but because there's nothing left to engage with. No emotional leverage. No predictable guilt. No urgency. And without reaction, there is no supply. You don't feel victorious. You feel free. This is important. Freedom doesn't feel like winning. It feels like no longer needing to play. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need to explain your growth. You don't need validation for your boundaries. Your peace becomes self-contained. This is the final answer to the question you once asked. Was it me? No. It was a dynamic that required your nervous system to stay activated in order to function. And now that your system has settled, the dynamic no longer has a place to land. Closing bridge, binge watch invitation. At this stage, many people notice something else. They begin questioning not the past, but the patterns that allowed it. In the next video, we'll explore why empathetic people are targeted by narcissists, and how to break that pattern for good. If this video helped you understand yourself with more compassion, stay here. This channel isn't about fixing you. It's about helping you stop blaming yourself for what you had to survive. Your softness was never the problem. It was never protected. And now, it finally is.